Hey rational ones, Farid here. Let's cut right through the noise. There's a story you've been told, a convenient little fact, that Christian apologists and even some lazy historians trot out, like a prize racehorse every time the existence of Jesus is questioned. It's their supposed knockout punch. But Farid, they whine. What about Josephus? The first century Jewish historian, Flavius Josephus, he proves Jesus existed. It's right there in his book, Antiquities of the Jews. It's independent non-Christian proof. Game over, atheists. Game over? Don't make me laugh. What if I told you that this proof is one of the most intellectually dishonest pieces of historical wishful thinking ever sold to the public? What if I told you that the very passages they cling to are so blatantly tainted, criminally manipulated, and logically useless that they actually serve as better evidence for pious fraud than for a historical Jesus? Today, we're not just questioning the narrative, we are taking a sledgehammer to it. We are going to dissect the so-called Testimonium Flavianum and expose it for the forgery it is. We're going to show why Flavius Josephus, our best non-biblical window into first-century Judea, effectively never mentioned Jesus in any way that holds up to an ounce of critical scrutiny. Forget what you've heard. It's time to look at the evidence for what it really is. Let's get rational. Okay, before we bring the hammer down on the evidence itself, let's be crystal clear on why this one man, Josephus, is the battlefield on which this argument has to be fought. Why does his name even come up? Think about it. Flavius Josephus is our ground zero. He is the primary non-Christian, non-biblical source for the history of first-century Judea. This isn't some random scribe writing a century later from a different continent. The man was there. Born Yosef ben Mattityahu around 37 AD, just a handful of years after Jesus was supposedly executed, he was a Jewish aristocrat, a military commander in the Jewish-Roman War, and later, a historian living in Rome under the patronage of the Flavian emperors. This is crucial. He was not a Christian. Let me repeat that, because it's the entire reason apologists are so desperate to claim him. He had zero theological reason to promote some new messianic cult from Galilee. His job was to document the history, the people, the politics, and especially the uprisings and troublemakers of his homeland for his Roman bosses. He knew the landscape, he knew the players, he knew the factions. He is our only significant contemporary window into that world outside the bubble of the New Testament. So logically, if a miracle-working preacher named Jesus had caused a massive stir, won over, quote, many Jews and Greeks, was crucified by Pilate, and then sparked a movement that, quote, has still to this day not disappeared, Josephus would be the guy to tell us about it from an objective historical perspective. If he confirmed the story, it would be huge. It would be the one piece of external evidence that might actually carry some weight. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. The moment you actually scrutinize what he supposedly wrote, the entire argument doesn't just stumble, it completely falls apart. So when the apologist pounds the table and screams, "Josephus," what are they actually talking about? What is this supposedly ironclad proof they hang their entire case on? It boils down to two little passages in Josephus's magnum opus, the 20-volume Antiquities of the Jews. That's it. Out of a massive comprehensive history, their case rests on a couple of paragraphs. First, there's the main event, the one they treat like the holy grail of historiography. It's a chunk of text in Book 18 that has been given the grand-sounding name, the Testimonium Flavianum. This is their star witness. Then, buried deep in Book 20, you have a much shorter, almost throwaway line about the execution of, quote, James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. This is their backup, the best supporting actor. And for a long, long time, people just accepted this. They'd point to the page and consider the debate settled. But that's what happens when you don't ask the hard questions. That's what happens when you're afraid to look closer. Because when you do, you don't just find a few minor issues. You find gaping, glowing, impossible to ignore red flags that scream forgery and manipulation. So let's start with their star witness, the Testimonium Flavianum, and see just how quickly it perjures itself under cross-examination. Alright, let's put this star witness on the stand. The Testimonium Flavianum from Book 18 of Antiquities. For years, apologists have waved this paragraph around like a bloody shirt to prove their case. Let's look at the words themselves. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. Stop. Right there. Red flag number 1. If indeed one ought to call him a man, that's not the language of a sober historian. That's the language of a worshipper, hinting at divinity. Josephus, the pragmatic, Roman-sponsored historian, would never write this. But it gets worse. He was a performer of surprising deeds. He won over many of the Jews and also many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. Game over. He was the Messiah. A non-Christian, Pharisaic Jew, writing for a Roman audience, flat out declares that this guy from Galilee was the Christ, the Anointed One. This central figure of Jewish messianic prophecy? Are you kidding me? If Josephus believed that, he wouldn't be Josephus. He'd be the Apostle Peter. As scholar Dr. Richard Miller puts it, if you take this text at face value, you'd walk away going, clearly Josephus was the most dedicated Christian I've ever heard of. It is so unbelievably pro-Jesus, it reads like a creed. This isn't history. It's a baptismal confession clumsily shoved into a history book. And it doesn't stop there. When Pilate had condemned him to a cross, he appeared to them spending a third day restored to life, for the divine prophets had foretold these things. The resurrection, the fulfillment of prophecy, this isn't a historical report. It's the entire Gospel of Mark summarized in one fraudulent paragraph. Second, look where this glowing tribute is located. The contextual evidence is a disaster. Josephus places this passage right between two stories of what he calls outrages. First, a story about Pontius Pilate brutally suppressing a Jewish protest over an aqueduct. Then, immediately after the Jesus passage, a salacious story about Roman nobles tricking a woman into a temple to be assaulted by pretending to be the god Anubis. So, the sequence is violent suppression, salacious scandal, and sandwiched right in the middle is this beautiful, glowing report about Jesus the Messiah. It makes no narrative sense. It's a jarring, dislocated, pasted-on segment. Dr. Miller argues convincingly that the original text here was likely negative, a stain, as he calls it, describing Jesus as just another one of the many seditious troublemakers Josephus was obsessed with documenting. An account so ugly that later Christians couldn't just tweak it. They had to rip it out and replace it entirely. Third, and this is the smoking gun, the silence of the witnesses. In the 3rd century, more than 100 years before our earliest manuscript of the Testimonium, the brilliant Christian scholar Origen wrote extensively about Josephus. He quotes from Book 18. He knows Josephus's work inside and out. And guess what? Origen never mentions the Testimonium Flavianum. Even worse, Origen explicitly states, multiple times, that Josephus did not believe Jesus was the Christ. This is a direct contradiction of the text we have today. The only logical conclusion is that the glowing Christianized Testimonium was not in the copy of Josephus that Origen was reading. So who's the first person to ever quote it? The 4th century church historian and propagandist-in-chief, Eusebius, the guy whose job it was to craft a history favorable to the newly empowered Christian empire. Convenient, isn't it? Finally, the evidence of tampering is all over the text itself. Some earlier Latin and Syriac translations don't say he was the Christ. They say he was believed to be the Christ. This shows that even ancient scribes were uncomfortable with the blatant Christian language and tried to water it down. It's a forger's fingerprints left at the scene. So let's stop pretending this was some lone monk making a few edits. The evidence points to something far more systematic. This was likely an intentional redaction, a surgical removal and replacement of an embarrassing passage. An operation that could only be carried out once the Christian church had state power, likely by imperial edict under someone like Constantine, who had the money and the political will to scrub history clean and commission new, corrected copies for the major libraries of the empire. This isn't evidence for Jesus. It's evidence of historical revisionism on a grand scale. The Testimonium Flavianum is a fraud. Case closed. Okay, so the Testimonium is a smoldering crater of fraud. We've established that. But at this point, the apologist, sweating, backed into a corner, pulls out their last pathetic line of defense. But what about the James passage? Yes, let's talk about the backup plan. Buried deep in Book 20, Josephus is describing the illegal actions of a high priest named Ananus, and he mentions that Ananus brought before the Sanhedrin a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who is called the Christ, and certain others. Now, to be fair, Many scholars see this as more likely to be authentic than the dumpster fire of the Testimonium. But more likely is a low bar, and it certainly doesn't mean it's useful evidence. First, that little add-on, who was called the Christ, reeks of a later Christian scribe, helpfully adding a note in the margin that got clumsily copied into the main text. As Dr. Richard Carrier argues, it's a classic sign of interpolation, a little clarification, to make sure you know which Jesus he's talking about. But let's be generous. Let's pretend every single word is 100% authentic Josephus. So what? What does this passage actually tell us about a historical Jesus? Absolutely nothing. Zero. It's a passing reference to identify someone else. The subject of the sentence is James. Josephus is using a famous brother as a nickname. It's like saying, the brother of Elvis, who was called the King. It doesn't prove Elvis could sing, that he lived at Graceland, or that he wore a jumpsuit. It proves nothing about the man himself. This line doesn't confirm Jesus' life, his teachings, his miracles, or his resurrection. It simply assumes the reader already knows of a figure called Jesus. And as Carrier points out, there's no clear narrative reason for Josephus to even include that detail, making its reliability for Jesus' historicity weak at best. It's a footnote, a flimsy, questionable, and ultimately useless footnote that proves nothing. This isn't the evidence they're looking for. But let's zoom out for a second. Let's get to the absolute heart of why the entire Josephus argument is a house of cards. Because even if you want to ignore the blatant forgery, ignore the useless footnote, the whole premise is built on a fundamental logical fallacy, the myth of the independent witness. For a source to be useful for historical corroboration, it has to be independent. It has to provide information that doesn't come from the very claims it's trying to support. It can't just be an echo in the same chamber. That's historical method 101. So let's apply this basic logic. In the absolute fantasy best-case scenario for the apologist, where Josephus himself wrote something positive about Jesus, where did he get his information? Dr. Richard Carrier has demonstrated convincingly that if Josephus wrote the core of the Testimonium, his source was almost certainly the Gospel of Luke, specifically the Emmaus narrative. Think about what that means. Josephus isn't acting as an independent historian confirming events. He's just repeating Christian stories. He becomes a secondary source reporting on Christian beliefs, not a primary source reporting on a historical man. That is not independence. That's called gossip. And for a critical historian like Josephus, who demanded eyewitness accounts, repeating these kinds of stories would be, as Carrier notes, laughable. But the connection is even more damning. The literary overlaps between Josephus's writings and the New Testament's Luke Acts are massive. So massive that scholars like Professor Steve Mason argue for direct literary dependence. We don't even know for sure who was copying whom, but it doesn't matter. They are so intertwined. One is likely responding to or borrowing from the other, that they cannot be treated as separate, independent accounts. Dr. Miller even argues that Luke Acts seems to be actively fixing the narrative, creating a more palatable, pro-Roman Jesus to contrast with the rebellious messiahs Josephus describes. And here is the unbreakable rule of historiography that apologists pray you never learn. As Dr. Carrier states with brutal clarity, if independence cannot be established, the source is unusable as evidence. It is worthless for corroboration. It's an echo, not a second voice. So the supposed proof from Josephus isn't proof at all. It's either Christian propaganda, an unreliable retelling of Christian propaganda, or simply not Josephus's own words. It fails the single most important test for an external source. So, let's step back and survey the wreckage. After all the noise, the desperate claims, and the historical gymnastics, where does this leave us? It leaves us with this unavoidable conclusion. Flavius Josephus, the linchpin of the argument for a historical Jesus, the supposed ultimate non-Christian proof, provides no credible independent confirmation for the figure described in the Gospels. None. Let's recap the case file. The star witness, the Testimonium Flavianum, is a proven fraud. It's an obvious Christian forgery, with language no non-Christian would ever use, jammed awkwardly into a narrative where it doesn't belong, and which our best early witness, Origen, never even saw. The backup witness, the James passage, is a flimsy, ambiguous footnote that's likely contaminated itself. And even if you grant its authenticity in a fit of charity, it's utterly useless. It tells us nothing about Jesus, and fails the basic test of providing new information. And the entire premise of Josephus as an independent source is a myth, shattered by the clear literary dependence between his work and the Christian scriptures. Let's be brutally honest. If the real Josephus had mentioned Jesus in a way that was consistent with the rest of his work, his life's project of documenting Jewish rebels for his Roman masters, he would have painted him as just another troublemaker, another sign prophet, another false messiah, leading the people astray, just like the dozens of others he describes in explicitly negative terms. The fact that we don't have that, but instead have these manipulated, fraudulent passages, speaks volumes. The historical record, where it should be strongest, is a void. Josephus, the historian of first-century Judea, offers no clear, uncompromised support for the traditional Jesus. This leaves us with a stark historical picture. The first century is profoundly silent on Jesus, outside of the faith-based, biased, and contradictory writings of his own followers. So, what's the verdict? Is Josephus the star witness for the prosecution of historical truth? Or is he just Exhibit A in a case of ancient religious fraud? I want to see a war in the comments below. Bring your best arguments. Let's get into it. If this demolition of bad evidence and lazy thinking brought you some rational clarity today, do me a favor and absolutely obliterate that like button for the YouTube algorithm. And if you are committed to tearing down historical myths and building your worldview on a foundation of solid evidence and reason, then make damn sure you are subscribed to the Rational Farid. Ring that notification bell so you never miss another takedown. Share this video. Arm your friends and family with the facts. The next time someone tries to pull the Josephus card in a debate, they'll be ready to shut that nonsense down for good. Until next time, stay critical, stay rational,